Welcome to our webinar, everybody. We're very glad to have you with us today. I hope that at the end of this, you will have some valuable gold nuggets and that you walk away feeling like you've actually had some value added to your life and your career. Before we get started with the introductions, so just some house rules. You should be able to hear me, but no one is going to be able to hear you. You should be muted. If you have any questions, please put them into the text box or the question box. We will get to those at the end of the presentation. And at the end of this, we will make the recording available to you all. So to get started, my name is Bruce Damon. I am an Inspired Testing Director. I have lots of years of experience in performance testing, touching on 18 years. And I have worked with Neil and, Neotis and Tricentis now for the last probably 18 odd years, starting 2006. Inspired Testing is a pure play testing company. We focus purely on functional automation and performance testing. And through our technology partnership with Thomson Reuters, we have a great focus on the legal industry and specifically with the implementations and upgrades of Thomson Reuters Elite 3E. I think that's pretty much it from my side. Neil, over to you.
So my name's Neil Williams. I'm a solution architect for Tricentis. Effectively, that means I'm technical sales. And obviously, I'm a technical specialist focusing just on NearLoad.
Hello there. I'm Mike Smith. I'm the head of sales for Neoload for Tricentis for the UK and Ireland. I've been in performance testing about same as Bruce, about 17, 18 years. Worked on some big projects like the launch of DirectGov and the Passport Agency, New Looks retail part, but probably the most interesting was Pottermore, the Harry Potter site working with J.K. Rowling. So hopefully I bring a little bit to this and I look forward to speaking to you all later in the Q&A.
Excellent. Thanks, gents. I think what's important is to note that we will get into some demos later on, but we will not be sharing any actual legal clients' information or names. So fear not, your names and identities are safe. Great. Neil, thanks. Can we go to the next slide? So what we'd like to impart is some values from this webinar is I will talk a little bit about our overview and our approach to performance testing on Elite 3E. We will touch on some issues that we've come across before and in execution, ways that we've made use of Neoload and some of its functions to increase the execution cadence, decrease the time of scripting, which then obviously increases your overall return on investment. Integration with CDCI tool sets, continuous testing, shift left concepts come into play there, and then how to get business value from the integration with APM tools. So touching on the problem statements is probably the same for Elite 3E rollouts to any other performance testing project. Ultimately, what you want is to be able to implement or upgrade your 3E implementation without having any performance bottlenecks or performance issues. You want your timekeepers and administrators to interact with 3E without a break in service. I have some examples that we'll touch on later on where an implementation of 3E from enterprise went awry and it caused massive downtime. And what you don't want is, really angry senior partners to come down on you. So we'll touch on some of these problem statements a little later on as we go through. But I think before we get to that, we can go to the next slide. Thanks, Neil. I'd like to just take you through our approach to performance testing 3E. We like to touch or follow effectively the 3E lifecycle: client matter, work in progress, billing, receipting, and reporting. And if you have a look on the right, those sort of high-level user journeys are some of the user journeys that we focus on. Now, the Pareto principle comes into play here, the 90-10 rule. 90% of your volume will be generated by 10% of your transactions, 80-20, same type of thing. So effectively, those high-level user journeys look something more along the lines of the following. So you can see there that 11 odd high-level user journeys spin into 25 to potentially 40 deeper level user journeys. And that covers effectively that 3E life cycle. I am yet to come across an implementation that was stock standard, even though some implementations are branded as pure vanilla. There is always some kind of customization and level of change or different integration. So whether you use Intap or BizTalk, your copy track or Carpe Diem or Chrome River, a whole bunch of other tools. Even that in itself is a form of customization. And then there's different templates and different workflows to get you through the performer and bidding process. So what I'm definitely going to touch on is ways that we have implemented the use of some of the frameworks and different tools within Neoload to decrease the time of scripting for different clients and increase your ROI. All right, so let's focus on those first two problem statements. So I've changed it to stumbling blocks and value adds, because this, I think, is what Inspire testing can bring to legal clients and what we've brought to the table for some of our previous clients. I think we're all aware that in the process of implementing a performance testing project, or going through that process of doing performance testing on a project, the part of the project where you're spending most of your time and money is during that scripting phase. And we say scripting, it's not referring to test cases, it's referring to creating an automated user journey that can be used to simulate the processes, those user journeys that I showed you before. Now, Nearload have a couple of things that we use, a couple of concepts that we use for our clients to bring down or decrease the time it takes for us to create these scripts. The first concept is the concept of frameworks. We make use of frameworks, which is effectively a library of rules, be it left and right boundaries to capture values in the middle, or relative XPaths or XPaths. And what this allows us to do is capture dynamic values such as your matter numbers or invoice numbers, entity numbers, that type of dynamic values that are generated on the fly, or session IDs, session values. And string them through the process, through that user journey to make sure that this journey flows from start to finish. This allows us to, or effectively, this is the difference between an automation tool and a performance testing tool like Nearload. Whereas Nearload allows us to run multiple hundreds of users on an injector machine, whereas use an automation tool, that relationship is one-to-one, one user journey for one injector machine. We'll touch on this a little bit later, but we have, through the use or through running a couple of these projects, created a framework for 3E that we're able to take from one project to the next and even one client to the next to reduce the time it takes us to create these scripts. Now, it's worth noting that it refers specifically to correlations. Correlation means it's the capturing of those dynamic values. Having that done automatically at the end of the recording of that initial journey is a massive saving of time. Great. The next concept that we often make use of is the concept of user path updates. Sometimes, whether it be through a UI update or other releases, internal releases that your team make, something breaks and you need to effectively redo or re-record the entire user journey. Now, Neoload's function of user path updates bring down this time that it takes for us to get that new, effectively a version 2 of that user journey in place. What it does, it allows us to link the steps from a previous user journey with the new version of the user journey, bring across the correlations and the parameters that were updated or created initially, and effectively negates us to have to do that again at the end of it, at the end of the process. So effectively, this allows us to re-record and redevelop an entire set of scripts in 30 to 40% of the time it took us initially. You can see that there's a major benefit there in terms of time savings and bringing down the cost. The third concept that we often make use of is the concept of shared containers. A shared container is exactly that. We containerize parts of these user journeys, login, for instance, creating matter, creating or updating timekeepers details. We can containerize those and use them as shared containers. If you do this enough time, the concept effectively means that you could create an entire user journey by dragging and dropping some of these containers. Now, in Elite 3, we've not really done that before. We've never seen it necessary or even possible to string an entire user journey together purely by dragging and dropping. But what this allows us to do is, if there is a specific change through a UI update or configuration change that only affects reporting or only affects login or only affects we can update that single block, containerized block of the script in one area, and it then gets dragged through and affected in all of the other user journeys. And that in itself is a major time saving as well. This just means that you could go through a UI update that targets a specific part of 3E without having to re-record and redo and redevelop all of the user journeys that were developed to that point. Okay, I mentioned data management as well. So data management, in my mind, means access to potentially production data. We definitely avoid having access to production in the first place, as well as production data. You know, these are sensitive things that we have potentially access to. And our clients, we sometimes help clients with obfuscating this data for the use in their test environments. So in terms of data management, it is important for us to be able to create our own data so that we have control over what we use and how the user journeys are strung together. So oftentimes we will create matter to start an entire user journey off, and that could happen multiple times for multiple different scripts, or at the start of a project, create a base set of data that we can then use going forward through for all of the scripts in all of the test executions. I don't think there's much I need to say further in terms of data management. I think sort of all of the integrations touch on this. You know, whether you use CopyTrack or Chrome River for expenses and all that, a lot of the data can be created up front and then reused throughout the process. Now, point 2 over there talks about enabling the client. And effectively, I'm jumping from the handover at the end of an engagement or a project to a talk that will filter through to a demo that Neil's going to do very shortly for us. With Neoload being scriptless, it oftentimes it never requires the users to be skilled in development. This means that Inspire Testing could hand over the project to a client, enabling you to keep on executing, you know, the assets that have already been developed, making use of the scripts that have been developed, to carry on and continue getting the benefit from the performance testing process to that point. I think what we also do for some clients is we can provide the training. So we are certified training partners of Tricentis for Nearload. So where the clients absolutely want to end an engagement, we oftentimes have certification training for some of their staff to enable them to take these projects further and then become the performance tester within the project. I think at this stage is a good time to hand over to you, Neil. I think we've talked about the UI, we've talked about some of the concepts to reduce the time it takes us to create scripts. Yeah, it'll be great for you to give us a bit of a demo.
Yeah, of course. So let me move on one slide. So as Bruce mentioned, Nearload itself has a visual test editor. He also mentioned correlations frameworks and the shared containers. So what I'm going to do is I think it's worthwhile just to show you what that looks like inside Nearload. So let's move away from slides. We'll go to the Nearload tool itself. Now, Nearload is a desktop installation. It's installed on your laptop. So when you're developing your test, obviously you're using it on your everyday machine. But what we've got here is we've got a number of user journeys, flows through a system. And Nearload supports a range of technologies, queuing mechanisms, web services, REST APIs, and so on. But what I'm going to do is I just want to show you a web example. So in this web example, obviously this is not 3E, but Bruce mentioned there's a visual editor, a visual representation of your test. So you can see here I've got an example test I've recorded. Each one of these steps here is a business transaction. And that's purely because users don't tend to think of downloading style sheets and bitmaps and JPEGs. They're thinking in business terms of logging on, doing a search, doing an update. So what you can see here, we've got the visual flow, if you like, through an application. And obviously one of the things that Bruce mentioned as well is handing over to the end user, handing over to a customer, enabling a customer. And the idea behind that is you don't have to have any development skills. You don't have to concern yourself about a bracket in the wrong place or something that won't compile. So I've got this visual test here. If I do want to control or change the flow, drop in an if statement, drop in a loop, it is just all drag and drop. So for example, I can grab a loop. I can take this loop and just drag it into my test. And then this example here is an online shopping system. But I could say, let's take the product and put it in the shopping cart, and we'll just drop that inside a loop. How many times around the loop do I want to go? Well, let's say 6 times around the loop. But obviously, loop itself is a bit meaningless. So again, when you're developing this test, this flow through a system, you can put in meaningful descriptive information. So I could say in here, for example, put 6 items into the basket, for example. So that way, when I hand this over to a colleague, when I hand it over to a customer, you can understand the flow, you can understand the journey through a system. Now, one of the other things that Bruce all touched on, though, is about correlation. So, the server sent me a value that I have to then return. And obviously, in real life applications such as 3E, there could be a lot of changing, moving values in that test. Now, NearLoad has the ability to correlate that for you. So I'm going to do it manually just to show you an example of what Bruce was referring to. I've got a token. Could be a session ID, could be a cross-site scripting token, anything that represents this user connection to 3E, for example. So what I can do here is I can just double click that. I can say, let's use the extracted value, and we'll get NearLoad to do it for us. And it's done. So NearLoad now has glued those values together. If the server sends me a value that NearLoad then has to send back, it doesn't really matter what that value happens to be. It's a dynamic moving target, obviously, but whatever the server sends us, we will return back. Now that's fine for this session here. I fixed one issue for one recording for now. But Bruce mentioned the power of frameworks. So if I open this up again, I can actually add this to a framework. And what that effectively means is I've learned the lesson. I'm going to add it to a framework. I'll check it back into source control, and I'll share it with the rest of the team. And I've learned the lesson. I share it with my colleagues, and it basically means that when you're recording an application such as 3E, you could end up with a dozen or a couple of dozen of these correlation rules. And the whole idea about correlation and frameworks is it's taking that recorded test and turning it into a working playing test. Once I've added this to the framework, if I was to record a brand new test, at the end of the recording process, the post-recording wizard pops up, and we can simply say, let's just run the framework. So whether there's 5, 10, 15, 200 things to correlate, NearLoad will just, effectively blitz through the test and fix everything it finds based on those rules. Now, one of the other things that Bruce mentioned was user path update. Now, again, I just want to give a quick example of this. So I've got a login step. I go to a login page and I send in my username and password. Obviously, from a 3E scenario, every script that you record, every test you create, is going to have to go through that process of logging on. So what I could do is I could say, I'm going to take a transaction from the action bar at the bottom. I can drop that into my test, and I can take the login page and the sending in of my username and password, drop it into the transaction, and then I might just call this reuse login, which is fine. But I can then mark it as a shared container. Now, what that effectively means is this shared container down here, if I start changing the name and updating the name, so we'll just call it demo, for example, or demo shared containers, you can see as I change one, the other one gets updated. And obviously, if I change the one in the script, the shared container gets updated. The whole idea about all of this is why have 15 scripts that all log on? Why not just have 15 scripts that call one login piece? And if the login flow changed, I only have to update it in one place. Now, the other thing that Bruce mentioned was about the user path update. When I record this test, if I do have a new version of this purchasing scenario, then I'll have a version 1 test, I'll record a version 2, and NearLoad will merge the two together. So in version 1, I've put in my loops, I've correlated it, I've got test data. In version 2, there might be a few extra clicks and some more navigation. So what NearLoad will do is it will basically take all of the valuable stuff from version 2 and drop it back into version 1. So you don't lose any of your you don't lose any of your existing investment. Now, the other thing about doing user path update that I just want to quickly touch on before we hand back to slides and Bruce is I don't want to have to re-record this entire scenario just to update the login piece. Because again, it's, 90% of the test hasn't changed, it's just a login that's updated. So I don't want to have to recreate the entire test. So from a modular point of view, I could have a login user journey that just has the login steps. So when I do a re-recording here of just the login, then I can do a quick 30-second re-record of this piece here. That gives me login version 2. I've got login version 1 already. And again, using user path update, I can just merge the two together. So even when you're developing a test, it's about keeping those best practices in mind, small, reusable, modular components that effectively you could daisy chain together. So I just wanted to kind of touch on and put some context, if you like, in terms of what Bruce has covered earlier on. So if I go back to PowerPoint, so hopefully I've kind of given you a bit of a flavor for all of this. The one thing we didn't really touch on was transactions in that much detail, but login, search, updates, save, these transactions are actually timers. How long did login take? But again, just going back to NearLoad quickly, you can also think of them as being like commenting your flow. Go to the homepage, enter, log in, put something in your shopping basket, check out. So we're timing all of this, but it also just means that your test is completely easy to follow, readable, easy to understand. So let's go back to PowerPoint, and I will just hand over to Bruce in a second. The one thing I wanted to do just before I kind of pass control back is Bruce mentioned that Inspired have developed a framework against 3E. Now, in a real life application, because obviously that was a demo application, there might be 10, 20, 30 things to correlate. They might pop up 4 or 5 times each. So if you imagine 30 updates popping up 5 times each, that's 150 fixes. Having NearLoad to scan your test and saying, I'll fix that, I'll fix that, I'll fix that, you could be fixing 150 issues in 2 or 3 seconds. So obviously in this framework here, the 3E framework, you can just see from the screenshot, there's 30 plus things to correlate, and that framework comes obviously with Inspired. So let me pass back over.
Neil, thank you for that. I think that was massively valuable. Unfortunately, we did not redo an entire project in a 3E sandbox environment. That would have been great to show, some of the actual 3E processes, but and also we didn't want to expose any client data. So thank you for that. I think it was still super valuable. All right, so let's get to the next bit of the the stumbling blocks, the problem statements. I'll talk about test environment sizing, specifically focus on baseline load balancing, and then coming in from across the globe, and then how the sizing of an environment really impacts the result extrapolation. So I will touch on some of this later again, but it's very seldom that we're able to really test in a production-sized environment. Oftentimes we have to test in a staging environment that is scaled. It's whereas production could have 15 to 20 different WAPI servers, maybe the staging environment only has 5 or less. And there's a couple of things that come into play here. Is baselining. If you need to go from, and I think a great example is Silverlight. About a year ago, a lot of people had to migrate from the Silverlight version of 3E to the HTML5 version. So creating a baseline on Silverlight was critically important, because what you need to do is really understand that what you're going to, or the instance that you're going to, performs at least as quick as what you had before. In that case, we had to develop 2 completely different set of tests, user journeys. one for the Silverlight, because they're completely different technologies, but one for Silverlight, one for HTML5, and as closely as possible mirror the user journeys. Now, workflows to a certain extent were different, screens were different, and obviously the technology was different, but we were able to create a baseline and a comparative test and run these in what was a staging environment and 2B production environment. Running in 2B production is great because you're actually verifying that the production environment that you're going onto and that will be in place will be capable of dealing with the loads that you want to be thrown at it. All right. I spoke about different numbers of WAPI servers. Load balancing comes into play here. If you're coming in from 5 injector machines, or load injector machines, but your estate is, you've got 15 different WAPI servers, then if you're making use of IP-based load balancing, potentially you will exclude 10 of those WAPI servers from your test. The 5 IP addresses will be routed to 5 different WAPI servers, and the questions will be asked why. We can make use of IP spoofing within NearLoad, and that's just a way for the load balancer to get tricked into believing that you're coming in from a whole bunch of different IP addresses, so that it spreads the load to all the different WAPI servers. But failing that, if you are testing in a scaled environment and you only have 5 or less of these WAPI servers, potentially it's easier to create load injectors that equal the number of servers you've got in the background. So that kind of is one thing to look out for. To simulate load from across the globe, I will reference 2 examples here, and both are for rather large legal clients. The one client had one instance of 3E, and what was critically important there was to make sure, using injectors all over the world, that, for instance, Australia didn't affect the operations in China through a data center that they were sharing. How that impacted, or the operations on the sort of east impacted the UK in the morning when it started coming up, and how the reporting and batch service or batch processes at night impacted the standard UK operation. And then late in the afternoon, UK time, how the American operation came into play and impacted that, and how all of the other stuff that happened, running up to the Americans coming online, how that impacted the performance for the US operations. So those were things that we needed to take into account. Throw in the security constraints with potentially having use or making use of lockdown laptops. We needed to be very clever in terms of how we had injector machines set up across the globe, and have NearLoad communicate to all of these injector machines. The second example is another rather large client, but they had different installations of 3E for all of the different geographical locations. Makes performance testing slightly easier because you're only sizing that geographical location or that instance of 3E for that specific location. And then obviously testing with specific load parameters for that location. You still have controller machines that will control all of NearLoad's the load distribution and the scripts that need to be executed. And that needs to talk to individual injector machines. So you have the same constraints, it's the consideration or the thinking behind how to create these load scenarios was slightly different and perhaps slightly easier. I think at this point, Neil, you've got a great slide to talk about the impact of environments and scaling of environments and testing and something that's not quite production size. So take it over. If you could share some insight there, that'd be great.
Thank you very much. Let me just move on the slide then. So let's click one more. So just following on from what Bruce has mentioned, when you're doing performance tests, it's all about realism. You want it to be as realistic as possible, because when it goes live, that's how a system's going to be used. But as Bruce has mentioned already, the chances of getting a production-sized environment are very unlikely, unless you are testing in production itself. Before a system goes live, you do have the option to test in production. Obviously, once it's gone live and you're testing an update, well, production is already in use. So the key thing really to look at is when you're doing testing and you're testing in pre-prod, UAT, staging, it's going to be a cut down instance. You're not going to have the luxury of having those big, powerful boxes. It's going to be a subset. So the key thing to look at here is, straight away, different hardware, it's not production-like. If you then consider, well, there's different configurations. It might not be tuned like production would be tuned. Some of the setup, some of the locations, some of the config files might not be as they should be compared to production. So the more changes you see, different networking, smaller network, less powerful network, that kind of stuff, the more changes you see here, you're getting further and further away from what production looks like, further and further away from what it's going to look like when it goes live. Even with a smaller database, for example, less data in a database means it's quicker to search, quicker to query, quicker to update. So again, the application is going to appear to be faster because the responses are coming back that much quicker. So obviously you can carry on with this, less users, because again, it's half the size of production, so it's not going to handle the same amount of load. So the key thing really is you're moving further and further away. So does that really mean that it's unrealistic? Not necessarily. Obviously Inspired have experience in testing in smaller environments. It's all about the extrapolation. I can't test up to 10,000 users. So why not test 250, 500, 1,000, 2,500, 5,000 maybe. And then once you've got those points plotted, potentially you can then extrapolate what the higher numbers will look like. Based on this curve that I'm generating, what does 10,000 look like? What would 12,500 look like, and so on. So it's all about just having that awareness of when you're designing, building, running a test, if you don't have a production, like environment, then it is about doing that education, that extrapolation, the educated guesswork, knowing the behavior of the system you're testing. So just putting a bit of a visual kind of aspect, if you like, to what Bruce has covered. So what I also wanted to do as well is I also wanted to go and show you a little bit of a demonstration, purely because Bruce mentioned the fact that, I may need to test from around the globe. I may need to test on external hardware. Maybe I don't have the machines on premise to generate the load I need. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump into NearLoad Web. So we'll go back to Slideware, we'll go back to NearLoad Web, and I will just log in once more. Now, the one thing I'm going to touch on here is around basically how do I run this test. So the first thing I want to show you is resources. So inside NearLoad Web, we'll wait for the web page to quickly render. We have different types of zones. Now, a zone is a kind of a meaningless term. A zone is a representation. Neil's garage could be a zone. The office, the Manchester office, could be a zone. It's just a location, an identifier, if you like, where machines are based. The important thing really is the type of zone. So, for example, here with static tends to be physical boxes or Docker containers. They're machines in a training room, maybe. So, I've got training room 6, it's got 5 machines inside it. Those machines are available to me to run my test. Those machines could be on-premise machines, because obviously they're static, they're connected boxes. But it could also be, as Bruce kind of alluded to as well, it could be machines in the cloud. For example, the NearLoad cloud platform. So, if you can test on-premise using on-premise boxes, absolutely fine. We can plug into those. But if you want extra hardware from the cloud, then obviously you could use cloud-based machines as well. And one of the other things that Bruce kind of mentioned as well is you can also have dedicated IP addresses. So if you are using machines from the cloud, then obviously allowing those cloud boxes to target any internal system that you're testing, obviously FreeE being the example, you can work with your IT team to allow that traffic in. It's coming from a trusted source, it's routed to the application under test, and obviously you can generate load against that application. The other thing just to mention on here as well is it might be your own cloud. Obviously you've got physical boxes, static boxes, but it could be our cloud, could be your cloud, could be Kubernetes, could be OpenShift, for example. It's all about generating the required load against the application under test, whether that's using on-premise hardware, maybe cloud-based or a hybrid of the two. Now, one of the other things I just wanted to touch on as well, just around kind of running this test, is if we choose this static zone, I can go back to one of my tests. I could pick this test, and effectively, if I share the configuration quickly, this is my test. There's my user load, 50 users, 30 minutes, and it's using on-premise hardware. It could be a mix of the two, as I said, on-premise and hybrid, but I'm going to run that test. Now, one of the things just to mention here is you may have a license to generate your load. You know, maybe it's an 800 user load test. But if you do need to burst, if you do need to, on the odd occasion, 800 is your business as usual number, but maybe you want to test up to 1,500 users or 2,000 users, but you don't want that license. You can also use what we call virtual user hours. You can think of it as a reserve fuel tank or an overdraft facility. I've got my everyday kind of load testing number. And then if I need to dip into that overdraft and test up to 1,500 users, 2,000 users, then obviously that's where the virtual user hours comes into it. But you can see here, I'm still using on-premise hardware, on-premise load generators, and I'm also spending the overdraft facility because, I've got an 800 user license. I need to do a 1,000 user test. So I am effectively using those VUH, those virtual user hours. So I just wanted to put a bit of context around kind of what Bruce was saying about, testing on premise, testing from the cloud, obviously using the license that you may or may not have, but also those burstable, those high number tests where you can just dip in and do those as well.
Thanks, Neil. I think that was pretty good. The next point and the final point that we'll touch on today is really talking about identifying bottlenecks. But I want to see that as a catch-all phrase to bring into the conversation here, the shift left and shift right approaches. Shifting left obviously means to us more continuous testing, we're enabling our clients to run more tests earlier on in the life cycle and just run them more often. Oftentimes this means integrating with a CDCI pipeline like Azure DevOps. We use this mainly for two reasons. It's a central repository for results and also a repository for our projects. We've been through examples where VM cleanups meant that a controller was lost because a junior decided to delete our controller VM, which meant the entire redo of a project the day before execution. So it's important to have these sort of backup options, and I think integrating with source code repositories is a great step forward for us in that case. And then the next concept really is how do we pinpoint exactly where bottlenecks are? We often make use of NearLoad's monitoring capability, which is really great. It provides us with an overlay of performance testing results with back-end resource utilization, but it's limited to what the technology stack is able to offer us. Sometimes you could highlight SQL statements that are slow running or spend a lot of time in the CPU. And oftentimes we will not be able to get that type of statistics. So the only way to really get to the bottom of bottlenecks is to then make use of APM tools. I'm not going to say too much further here. I think, Mike, you've got lots of experience on this. You've dealt with this in your days as a performance tester and continue to do so now. What's your opinion here?
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. Obviously, shift left, shift right, they're all terms that are banded around, and obviously people have got to utilize what they can to get the testing earlier in the dev lifecycle and have this continuous testing, like you say. NearLoad is the market leader, and obviously Inspired Testing are one of the leaders in their industry as well. And obviously they want to maximize their time for their clients, make sure that they can deliver more for the clients in the time that they've got available. And that obviously means they want to deliver more, they want to test more of their estate in less time, which will inevitably reduce risk when they go live with the application, and obviously reduce the risk of it having to be rolled back and the cost of that obviously it will inevitably cost. We've all been there, I'm sure. And one of those features is obviously the shift left, and the challenge is always that you're trying to get the developers, the designers, the coders to use a tool that they're not used to. How would they use NearLoad? Would they need training and all that kind of stuff? So they tend to use their own tool. But We have a few features that help designers and coders want to use it, because obviously we're trying to make it easy for them. And we have two significant features. One is called Test as Code, which enables them to kick off a performance test with a simple YAML file. So obviously that enables them to have consistency across the group in terms of they're all using the same tool, obviously getting the same result sets, helps Bruce and his team all be on the same page and deliver more quality. And then obviously we've got the ability to reuse functional test scripts. So if you can coordinate through the whole dev life cycle and work with the other teams, we can reuse scripts from the likes of Selenium and Tosca to kick up performance tests. And it becomes even more powerful, to be honest, because then you've got the functional side and the performance in one test, looking at how the performance is impacted by the functionality and vice versa, and that can have a massive advantage on picking up things early before when you go live. So that's obviously the sort of concept and how we help Bruce and his team deliver more without obviously their expertise and our sort of time-saving ability. But how does that work in reality? And obviously I think it's best that Neil shows you how that works. So I'll hand over to Neil, who'll explain it in a bit more detail.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. What I want to do is I'll just bring up a couple of slides and then I'll show you a bit of a demonstration. Obviously, as Mike kind of mentioned, the whole idea about shift left is test early. But obviously, it's not just about testing early, it's about testing often. So as soon as there's a change in an application, a config change, an update to a stored procedure, for example, you want to do that testing again, because we don't want to introduce any defects into the issue, into the application. Because obviously, we've all seen this slide before, but especially true with performance testing, the earlier you find a defect, the cheaper, the easier it is to fix. However, if you imagine you're building an office block, performance testing is the foundation, it's the architecture. There's no point having the most beautiful application in the world if it falls over at 50 users. So you need to make sure the foundation is solid. So, performance testing obviously makes sense, test early, test often, but it's especially valuable when it comes to doing performance testing in a life cycle. Obviously, as Mike mentioned, we're testing at different levels of the application. Hopefully, by the end of the process, releasing an application, making it go live. Hopefully, that's just a rubber stamp type exercise. Because if we've tested it early, we've tested it often, we've tested it repeatedly, there shouldn't be any unexpected surprises. So what I'm going to do is I just wanted to walk you through kind of an example of a demonstration. Now, one of the things that Mike mentioned as well was test as code. One of the things just to mention here is it's not code. It's a test definition language, but it does mean that if I'm a DevOps engineer, if I'm a developer, I don't have to learn NearLoad. I don't have to worry about having NearLoad installed on my laptop. It's all done via command line. I'm happy inside Visual Studio. I'm happy inside my Java IDE. So I can develop performance tests to test a service, for example, and still kick it off without needing to, go on a NearLoad training course, for example. So I just want to walk you through kind of these aspects. So let me go back to NearLoad. Now I'm actually going to go back to NearLoad Web here. And in fact, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to go back to Azure DevOps. Now, one of the things that Bruce mentioned that I wanted to jump on is Azure DevOps, you might be thinking CI/CD, but obviously as part of this, you've got source code repositories. There's no point having the project on my laptop, and as Bruce mentioned, someone takes my laptop away. They take down the controller, they decommission that machine. So one of the best practices is to put the project under source control. So you can see in here, I've got my NearLoad project in source control. It happens to be Azure DevOps, could be Bitbucket, could be GitLab, could be GitHub. It doesn't matter. From a team perspective, the people who are inspired, they're working as a team, they're scripting an environment. They want to be able to share changes and updates and have that secure repository. Also, as part of this source control project, I have my testers code files. Now, whether those testers code files are the entire test or whether they are just some override files, they're changing where the test data lives. They're changing the dynamics of the performance test. Am I going to use these load generators or those load generators? Is it going to be a 10 user test or a 50 user test? testers code files can be used just to override settings. And then obviously I've got my project and source control, but I've also got a pipeline. So I can have a look at this pipeline here. Let's go off and edit it, and I will show you what it looks like. Now, obviously I've got these testers code files, I've got this project that I can execute, but NearLoad Web has a command line interface. And what does that really mean? It basically means anybody can run a test from anywhere. So that's why we talk about, Azure DevOps, Git buckets, what was the other one? Bitbucket, sorry. GitLab, GitHub. It doesn't actually matter how you trigger a test. We have that same common way in. So we've got a command line interface for NearLoad Web. In NearLoad Web, I log in. In NearLoad Web, I create my test case and fill out some details. I upload my project, and then effectively I run it. So going back to NearLoad Web quickly, that's fine. Refresh that. I've been timed out, that's all. So again, coming back here to NearLoad Web, I can create a test case. So we're going here, create a test case, fill in the form, upload the project or check it out from Git source control, best practice, obviously. And then I click on that start button and I run it. So all of the stuff that I do inside NearLoad Web, effectively I can call from Azure DevOps or any other product as we mentioned. So I'm going to run this job. I'm logging on to NearLoad Web. I've got my authorization, my token, my credentials. And again, I can pick my default zone. Now, we've already talked about zones already. Are they cloud-based zones? Are they on-premise? Is it Neil's kitchen? Is it Neil's shed, for example? It's wherever those machines happen to live. I gave the example of Training Room 2 and Amazon, for example, on-premise versus cloud. So the zone is just the label, if you like, of where that hardware is connected. Now, what I've also got in this Azure DevOps example, though, is I've made it completely self-contained. In Azure DevOps, I spin up some Docker containers, connect them to NearLoad Web, and then when I run my test, I'm using those connected containers. So I'm just going to run this job. Now, unfortunately, I'm using a free Microsoft account, so I've been queued up. But, give it a few seconds, give it, maybe a minute, and this test will kick off because it will have its time on the queue, if you like. So that test is now running. And if I drill down into this, the first thing we're doing is we are installing the NearLoad command line interface because I want to download and install the latest version. Once I've installed the command line interface, I'm going to start up my containers and basically begin my test. So actually, I've got it in slightly wrong order. First thing I do is spin up my containers, connect them to NearLoad Web, check out the project, and now I'm installing the CLI. So once the command line is installed, I just tell it to run the test. And the whole idea is that this is completely repeatable. I provide the hardware, I download the appropriate components, I run the test. When I'm done, effectively, I can decommission the hardware. So this test is now running. Now, the test is designed to fail. If I go back into NearLoad Web, because Azure has told NearLoad Web, run me a test, NearLoad Web has taken care of the hardware. So let me go back to my project and home. You can see this test has kicked off. So Azure has provided the hardware, it's told NearLoad Web to run the test on that hardware, but NearLoad Web is responsible for provisioning the boxes. If Azure hadn't, plugged them in, then maybe we would have used cloud-based machines. Maybe we would have used some on-premise machines inside a legal organization. So I'm going to drill down into my test. If I scroll down the list here, you can see it's effectively initializing and launching. And any moment now, that test will kick off. Now, I'm not going to sit here while we watch a performance test run. I just want to show you the fact that it's got triggered. So as soon as we get to the graphs and we start seeing information being displayed, then obviously we'll jump back to the slide where. So any second now, it should kick off. And off we go. Now, the test itself is designed to have errors. Obviously, it's effectively errors so that I can demonstrate the errors and just talk about the errors. But the test is now running. It's only a 2-minute test kicked off as part of a CI/CD pipeline, but that CI/CD pipeline might be triggered when anyone checks in some code. It might be scheduled to run at 8 o'clock in the evening. However it's scheduled is completely down to yourselves. But the key thing is I've got visibility of the running test. So 8 o'clock in the evening, I don't have to worry about connecting to a box, logging in, or anything like that. I can simply open up a web browser and see what's happening. Now, obviously, all of these graphs are based on the values, the underlying data. Just in terms of the failures, I just want to jump into this quickly. The failures are based on the SLAs because I've modeled what good looks like. I've said this application should respond within inside a certain time frame. Every request, every element, every bitmap should respond within, I don't know, half a second or a quarter of a second. If it doesn't quite make it, then obviously I'm going to get failures. So really, that's the idea. As soon as you make a change to a piece of code, you check it in. You might run some smoke tests against it to make sure it's functioning correctly. But you can also then say, well, it works from a functional point of view. How does it scale? How does it perform? How does it perform? So you have that ability to kind of every single check-in, you have that reassurance that there's no unexpected surprises. So what I'll do is I'll go back to the slideware, and I'm just going to hand back over to Mike.
Oh, thanks, Neil. Yeah, so shift right obviously is very important because obviously what's important is to find the issue. When you do a performance test, generally you get a notification that you've got an error in a specific area, database or whatever it might be. Obviously, Nearload has its own monitoring, but it's obviously looking at the CPU and general areas of the infrastructure. That's why the shift right element, where you've got an APM like Dynatrace or AppDynamics, Datadog, New Relic, that kind of thing. It helps you pinpoint exactly within the application where the issue lies. So it actually pinpoints the line of code, for instance, where the performance issue started. So what this does, it enables you to quickly, as soon as you finish a test, have it pinpointed where you need to start looking and actually start fixing. And inevitably, it's about reducing risk when you go live, making sure that once you go live, you've got less bugs. Obviously, you probably have smaller bugs if you go by that graph that Neil showed. And yeah, hopefully a quicker time to resolution, which is what everyone's looking for, to make sure that they can actually get their things fixed as quick as possible. Then test again, and the test more often, test more of your estate philosophy comes into it with the continuous integration. And I think Neil's going to talk through how that works and how it looks in reality.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in with a quick comment. So obviously, you're running a performance test, maybe 2:15 in the afternoon, performance starts taking a turn from the worse, timing start increasing, the application starts struggling. The idea of shift right is obviously, NearLoad does come with monitoring. NearLoad could be looking at your web server, your app server, your load balancer. And the idea, 2:15, things start going wrong. Instead of you just wondering, well, where do I start? Having the ability to monitor gives you somewhere to start your investigation. But NearLoad monitoring is like, well, I'm looking at the application server, I'm looking at the counters, and I can see it struggling. So obviously you want to start your investigation there. But the use of APM tools is, well, if you've got an APM tool like Dynatrace, New Relic, Datadog, for example, it gives you the ability to drill down into that. You need to start looking at the application server, but using these type of technologies, and again, obviously it depends if you have these, but if you do have them, then you can say, well, actually, I'm looking at the application server. Where in the application server is it struggling? Which application? Which class? Which method? Which line of code? So the whole idea about having the monitoring and the integrations with APM is, again, it saves you time. You're not just randomly opening up log files and seeing if you can find an error message. It's targeting your investigation. It's that root cause analysis of where to start identifying the issues. And again, as Mike mentioned, it's all about time to resolution. We speed up the investigation, we identify where the cause is. Again, you raise a defect, you get it resolved quicker. But the idea is that you're not wasting time, you're not wasting cycles. you have a targeted approach.
Excellent. Thanks, Neil. I think before I summarize, just to give an example of what we've been able to do with using one of these APM tools, effectively using the APM tool to prove that it wasn't the backend that was really getting slowed down. It was the disk writing speeds, and one specific example in a legal client that were limited because of antivirus software. So, you could prove where the problems lie, but also that it doesn't lie in a specific location or where potentially people think it could be. And then you'll have to make use of some really clever and smart testing people to get to the bottom of some of these issues. So let's summarize. What have we covered? We have covered how to use NearLoad frameworks, shared containers, and user journey reworks to save you time and effectively money as well. We've covered the use of NearLoad Cloud and NearLoad Web, and how that helps us to test from different locations across the globe. We've integrated with DevOps pipelines. Most of our experience is really with Azure DevOps specifically for CDCI pipelines and for source control, and then combining NearLoad with the power of APM tools such as Dynatrace and Neuredic. I suppose the fifth point there really is how easy the interface, Neil spoke about this right at the start of the presentation, how easy the interface makes it for our clients to carry on and continue executing these tests after an engagement is finished. We have a specific approach to handing over projects to clients at the end of a project or at the end of an implementation. The last thing you want to do is have all of these assets, you spend all of this money, and you're stuck with nothing and you can't execute it. So we do have a handover process, and we try and make it as easy as possible for our clients to carry on executing and continue using what we've developed. And like I mentioned before, if you do need us to assist you with some training, then we are certified NearLoad trainers, and we could help you out with that journey as well. Great. So I think at this point we're going to hand over to the questions, and let's start answering some of the questions that have been asked over the course of the webinar. Well, we've received a couple of questions, so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to start reading these out. Some of these have come through as personal messages. So Mike, Neil, if you guys have any of those, then feel free to jump in. Mike, I'm going to direct this first one to you. What is the importance of application performance for your organizations? And what impact does performance have on the business? At what decision level is application performance taken into account? Application performance.
Application performance, probably more for Neil, actually, that one, I would imagine, in terms of the application performance strategy. But
cool.
I mean, obviously, application performance is important to every business. I think the challenge that most businesses have is getting the buy-in from the business at the top end. Obviously, the technical side see the value in performance testing. They want to performance test. They want to reduce risk. They want to be able to go live and actually, not see defects, not have to roll back, whether it be a client-facing site or an internal app. Obviously, which is going to disrupt normal working business. But like I say, the challenge normally is getting the buy-in from above and getting them to understand performance. And that's been my challenge over the years. So I think the decision process tends to be made at a technical level, but I think it needs to be at a much higher level to get them to appreciate the importance of performance, because obviously they hold the bigger budgets. That's where we're going to get the people more involved. That's where we're going to get more performance testing involved in projects. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Alrighty, Neil, anything to add there, or is that sufficient? Shall I carry on?
I think Mike pretty much covered it, really. So I'd say carry on.
All right, cool stuff. A couple of questions around the pricing and costing. Is NearLoad expensive? How is it licensed and priced?
I'll answer that one. Yeah, I mean, it's licensed pretty straightforward. It's an annual subscription. So obviously you can commit to 1 year, 3 years, whatever is your strategy. But I guess when you're looking at a performance testing strategy, you're looking long term. You want to, have something that you're going to have for a long time. You don't want to be changing strategy each year. But in terms of is it expensive? Obviously, we're the market leader, right? We wouldn't have become the market leader if we were too expensive. And I think expensive is a term that really isn't directed at just the tool, right? So it's about what's the total cost of ownership of performance testing, because obviously the cost of performance testing is how many bums on seats do you need to deliver the project. If you're going to test more often, test more of your estate, that means more bums on seats. That's going to be more personnel. If it's going to take time to do the scripting, it's going to take a lot longer. You're going to need people with coding skills and all that kind of stuff, where Nearload alleviates a lot of that, enables you to do more testing in less time. So what it does, even it's been proven in many case studies, and we can send these out, Bruce, if anybody wants to see them. We've actually got proof that actually we've been costed in a project against an open source tool. And actually, we've come out as a total cost of ownership of cheaper and less money and less cost than the open source. And I guess the biggest example I can give anyone of the value of Nearload is that we all know that HP once owned LoadRunner. When they sold LoadRunner to Micro Focus, they're our main competitor, they kept a lot of free licenses for themselves to carry on their performance testing. And then 2 years ago, they got rid of the free licenses of LoadRunner and they bought Neoload. So clearly we're not expensive because we brought the total cost of ownership down for HP, who are using their free version. And now they do a lot more testing in a lot less time. And from their point of view, it costs them less.
I think that's a great example where the actual vendor of a tool or owner of a tool then eventually swapped over to Nearload. That's a great example. Yeah. I think to add from my side, just on the costing, for shorter duration projects, because we're a partner of Tricentis, we could potentially provide our clients with access to virtual use hours for a couple of days. So if the execution cycle is only for 3 or 4 or 5 days, we can provide that and facilitate the actual license for execution. I think, Mike, I don't know if you want to touch on the different types of licensing right now, or perhaps just a really quick overview of that.
It's relatively straightforward in terms of the protocols, because our license includes all the protocols, whether it be web or API, Citrix. There's 2 different models if you need SAP and if you don't need SAP, basically. But it comes already with load generation from the cloud with different providers, so you can actually have a different provider than you are using yourself. So it comes with everything you need. There's no additional costs for different protocols or load generation or cloud control or all. It's all included.
Excellent. Great. Thanks. Just having a look at. Here is an Elite 3E specific question that came through. How about Elite Cloud? Would you still performance test in the cloud? I think I'll answer that one. The answer is yes. There's with all of the installations or all of the instances of 3E, there's pretty much always some form of customization involved. Configurations play into this, and just having dynamically scaled hardware available doesn't mean you should always use it. It becomes expensive to spin these up. So absolutely, even in the cloud, I would run with performance tests to make sure that you are working within the bounds that you've set initially. I don't know, Neil, anything that you'd add there? Cloud versus on-premise?
Obviously, testing in the cloud is one thing, but if you are migrating from an on-premise to the cloud, I would also say it's also valuable to test the on-premise system as well, because you don't know if you've made an improvement, whether it's in, performance has got better, got worse, if you don't know where you started from. So typically, if we are doing some sort of migration, I would obviously say, test it locally first, test the on-premise, test it in the cloud, and see if performance has improved or obviously got worse. So you always want that baseline to do that comparison against.
Excellent.
Yeah, and I guess that brings the point to regular testing. I think that brings the point to regular testing as well, because obviously a lot of people think that they test the release, it goes live, and then maybe they'll test again next year. But all the many releases along the way, obviously they're making customizations, like you say, adding things. And if you only test 6 months down the line, how do you find out which of those releases in between has actually been the problem? So I guess the regular testing is key.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks. Let's go to another legal or Elite 3 question. what are the average number of users that you normally test with for legal clients? It obviously depends on concurrency and the number of actual total users for the clients. I'd say that for most of our clients, we could get away with about 500 concurrent users, right? Concurrency means people actually doing physical work at that same time. But it depends. If you've only got 150 total, people on 3E, then you're not going to test with 500 users. What you need to take into account are two different things. It's month-end volumes, where you're actually getting everybody, capturing time, loading costs, all of that stuff, running reports at the same time, and then also your performance and your billings. So taking that load into account, that becomes really important. And then also year-end volumes, right? But that could potentially be 40 to 50% higher than your highest month-end load. So it's really important to cater for year-end loads when you're running performance tests. I think I've answered that one. Neil, maybe something
I was just
to
going to
you. Sorry, go for it. Yeah.
I was just going to add a comment today about virtual user hours, because obviously there is that business as usual. We test at this level day in, day out. But as you mentioned, with year-end loads, I don't have to buy a big license just for that year-end test. With virtual user hours, you can have those burstable days. So if you do need to kind of run an everyday level of testing, but even once a quarter, once at the year end, do a bigger test, virtual user hours is ideal for that.
Perfect. All right, Neil, maybe a question to you. Is there industry standard SLAs that is used for 3E or has been used in the past clients? Industry standard SLAs.
Me personally, I'm not aware of any kind of industry standard SLAs. I'd probably push the question back based on your experience with working with the legal industry. But in NearLoad, you can set SLAs. And typically, I don't want to kind of, set legal firms aside, but performance of a web application is performance of a web application. Doesn't matter if it's legal, retail, banking, or insurance. People these days have a feeling of what fast feels like. So you do want to have SLAs as part of your performance test, just so again, if performance is at the adequate level you expect. Because obviously, if an application is running slow, then there is a chance that people will move elsewhere. So having SLAs is vital. It gives you those pass or fail criteria, and it saves you having to do the detailed analysis. While I could look at 5 or 10, 15 different graphs, if I just know that the application should perform at this baseline, and if it's faster, fantastic. If it's slower, then obviously you need to do some investigation. So I'm not aware of any specific ones, but just from a general feeling, if a web page doesn't load within 3 or 4 seconds, it's not fast enough, really.
Yeah, look, I push that to you because I think it is exactly that. A web application is a web application, right? And we all want it to perform really fast. I do think they are specific. Different configurations impact the performance. You'd want to be able to create a timekeeper or update a timekeeper in a certain amount of seconds that don't frustrate the users. But I don't have specific SLAs that creating a timekeeper should be within a second or something like that. I don't think they really exist. I think that would be defined right up front, and then I think you did show us a little bit of the SLAs and how it relates or how it's shown in NearLoad Web. All right.
Yeah.
Neil, definitely a question for you. I'm going to shoot this over to you. Can NearLoad be used as an automation tool?
You can do, but it depends on what you're automating. So tricky question that. If you were testing things like APIs, web services, any message-based communication, then you can use it to do functional testing. You can feed in different variations of test data and obviously validate you get the expected results coming back. So that's absolutely fine when you're testing the lower level granular kind of components of the system. Obviously, you can functionally test it, but you can also then say, well, it worked for 1, worked for 20. Does it work for 100 or 1,000? So you can also take that same test and turn it into a performance test. When you're automating a web application, or even just a generic kind of application, NearLoad can be looking for values on the screen. Does this button have the same caption? Does this button have the correct caption? That kind of stuff. But automated tools test more than just kind of, am I on the right page? Does it have the right total? Does it have the right titles? Is the checkbox got the right check? Is a checkbox checked by default? That kind of stuff. Automation tools are typically testing much more detail than what we would do. So normally they're complementary. A functional test tool is concerned about the layout of the page, the spelling on the button. Is it the right font? Is the font the right size? You could do that with NearLoad, but you could also do it with an automated testing tool as well. With the likes of Tosca, for example, I could record an automated functional test. I could do all of my functional testing, and then I can transfer that into NearLoad. So I can reuse that use case without having to do a re-record, but it's a different type of test. NearLoad is focused on load generation. Tosca, for example, is focused on, does the screen work? Does the functionality behave?
Excellent. Thanks. The next two questions I'm going to combine into sort of one answer, I think, and I can take both of those. Can you create one set of scripts to cater for 3 in workspace? And the other one is, can you transfer scripts from one client to the next? The answer for the last question is no. They are specific. There are always some dynamic variables. Even though we create frameworks, you can't transfer a set of scripts from one client to the next. There's also some maintenance even from one environment to the next, so from dev to staging to other environments. The first question again was 3E in workspace. No, it's the same concept. Your standard 3E workspace is sort of a 3E light. It's a different user journey, a little bit easier to navigate, but you would still need to get through a user journey end to end and create the correlations and parameters as we spoke about during the presentation a little earlier on. Mike, maybe this one is an interesting one. I'd like to get your perspective on this. What will be the main areas of investment in performance engineering in the next 12 months? That's a cool one.
Well, given I'm mainly in sales, that's probably not for me. That's probably more for Neil. But I think it's probably a lot of people are moving in terms of tooling. Do you mean, or in terms of IT investment within the 3E?
I'm assuming the question is just engineering, but we're specifically talking about performance testing, so potentially tooling.
Yeah, I mean, we're all moving towards AI-driven stuff and trying to automate more. We're trying to try and use real user monitoring to actually you take the data from an application and just mirror that into a performance test, and all of that sort of is sort of coming together. That's what we're sort of striving towards. We've just added browser-based, so having more client-side metrics for people to understand, for retailers what the conversion rates might be affected by, helping people understand how things happen and obviously appear on the screen, stuff like that. So I think over the next year or so, that's where we are going with things. In terms of performance engineering and where people are going in that way, that definitely is more, I guess, for you and Neil, because you're more in the field than I am in terms of what's happening with the performance engineering.
I think it's more from a tool vendor perspective. Obviously, we need to continue to support all of the technologies that are being developed these days, because obviously it's always a moving target. As a new technology comes out, the performance testing vendors want to keep up with that and make sure it is testable. So obviously part of that is just keeping up with the market, making sure that we're able to support and test and obviously performance test those applications. In terms of just performance engineering in general, though, it's about the diagnostics. It's about identifying an issue, the root cause of that issue, and working out how to resolve it. Performance testing now isn't just kind of a matter of generating the load. It's figuring out why it failed, what the issue was. So drilling down into APM tools like Dynatrace, New Relic, obviously Datadog, with the new release, we also support Datadog. But it's giving the performance engineers the tools to allow them to quickly identify issues and get them resolved as quickly as possible. Because when a website is down, when an application is not working, effectively it's costing money. Every hour, every day it's not up and running, it's impacting people.
Absolutely agreed. Thanks for that. Thanks. Have you guys received any other questions directly to yourselves?
Someone was asking about whether we capture all the defects. So I mean, I can give a little answer now. I mean, obviously, it's impossible to say whether you'll always capture every single defect. I think the fact that the more testing you do and the more of your estate you cover, obviously, the more you're going to pick up, obviously, which obviously Neoload facilitates, because obviously it's much quicker to do scripting. You can do more scripts, you can do more testing in less time. And all I can do is, I guess, give an example of a large bank that we worked with. And they went from, testing 35 applications a week with 6 people, then moved to Nearload and actually were able to test 50 applications with only 4 people. And their crashes in production actually went down from 3 to 5 a week to only 1 a week. So it's not whether you're going to capture everything, but obviously what we can certainly show is that we will help you do more testing, deliver more quality, and reduce your risk, and obviously reduce the bugs and defects when you go live.
Good.
Anything to add there, Neil?
Anything else?
There wasn't really much I was going to add to that, no. Just in terms of, obviously, from a defect point of view, we don't know what we don't know. But as Mike mentioned, the fact that, it's easier to script, it's easier to create tests, run tests, you can do more testing in less time. Therefore, the more you check it, the more testing you're able to do, the more you've got of discovering those unknown defects.
This ties into a question that I sometimes get asked by clients: is, have I ever been involved with a release that didn't go well and was pulled? I think we've been lucky enough to not be involved with that. I think we've always captured bottlenecks before they happened as much as we potentially could. The thing there to note, Neil, and this touches exactly on what you just said, is that a test is only as good as the user journeys and the scope that you identify, that you include in this. Right? If you're not testing a specific report and that report ends up using all of the memory, it will absolutely impact results. So it's important to cover, I mentioned the Pareto principle, those journeys that cover or cater for 90% of your volume, but then also the outliers, those potential reports and back-end processes that will impact everything that runs on the front end. Because if you don't have proper coverage, you're just going to set yourself up for failure.
Exactly.
Yeah. Exactly.
I think that's it, gents. Anything else? Otherwise, I'm going to call it.
Nope.
No, I think that's
excellent. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining. We really appreciate your time. I hope that you go away with some gold nuggets, like I said right at the start. And I hope that you guys all join us for a next one at some stage in the future. Excellent. Thanks.
Thank you all.
Cheers.